The fleet system was made possible by the large, heavily armed ships called galleons that were used to carry the silver belonging to the crown. 2 great galleons a year also sailed from Manila in the Philippines to Mexico loaded with Chinese silks, porcelain, and lacquer, spelled Lacquer. These goods were then shipped on the convoy to Spain along with the American silver. In the Caribbean, heavily fortified ports such as Havana and Cartagena, in parentheses, Colombia, provided shelter for the treasure ships, while Coast Guard fleets cleared the waters of potential raiders. Although cumbersome, the convoys, which continued until the 1730s, were successful. Pirates and enemies sometimes captured individual ships, and some ships were lost to storms and other disasters. But only one fleet was lost, to the Dutch in 1627. In general, the supply of American silver to Spain was continuous and made the colonies seem worth the effort. But the reality of American treasure was more complicated. Much of the wealth flowed out of Spain to pay Spain's European wars, its long-term debts, and the purchase of manufactured goods to be sent back to the West Indies. Probably less than half of the silver remained in Spain itself. The arrival of American treasure also contributed to a sharp rise in prices and a general inflation, first in Spain and then throughout Western Europe during the 16th century. At no time did the American treasure make up more than 1/4 of Spain's state revenues. The wealth of Spain depended more on the taxes levied on its own population than it did on the exploration of its Native American subjects. However, the seemingly endless supply of silver stimulated bankers to continue to lend money to Spain because the prospect of the great silver fleet was always enough to offset the falling credit of the Spanish rulers and the sometimes bankrupt government. As early as 1619, Sancho de Moncada wrote that the poverty of Spain resulted from the discovery of the Indies. But there were few who could see the long-term costs of empire. Ruling an empire, state, and church. Spain controlled its American empire through a carefully regulated bureaucratic system. Sovereignty rested with the crown, based not on the right of conquest, but on a papal grant that awarded the West Indies to Castile in return for its services in bringing those lands and people into the Christian community. Some Native Americans found this a curious idea, and European theologians agreed, but Spain was careful to bolster its rule in other ways. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, between Castile and Portugal, clarified the spheres of influence and right of possession of the two kingdoms by drawing a hypothetical north-south line around the globe and reserving to Portugal the newly discovered lands and their route to India to the east of the line, and to Castile all lands to the west. Thus, Brazil fell within the Portuguese sphere. Other European nations later raised their own objections to the Spanish and Portuguese claims. The Spanish Empire became a great bureaucratic system built on judicial corps and staffed to a large extent by letrados, university-trained lawyers from Spain. The modern division of powers was not clearly defined in the Spanish system, so that judicial officers also exercised legislative and administrative authority. Laws were many and contradictory at times, but the Recopilation, spelled Recopilacio with a mark on top of it, N. 1681. The king ruled through 1681 codified the laws into I'll reread that sentence because of the spelling. Laws were many and contradictory at times, but the Recopilation 1681 codified the laws into the basis for government in the colonies. The king ruled through the Council of the Indies in Spain, which issued the laws and advised him. Within the West Indies, Spain created two viceroy viceroyalties in the 16th century, one based in Mexico City and the other in Lima. Viceroys, high-ranking nobles who were direct representatives of the king, wielded broad military, legislative, and when they had legal training, judicial powers. The viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru were then subdivided into 10 judicial divisions controlled by superior courts, or audiencias, staffed by professional royal magistrates who helped to make law as well as apply it. At the local level, royalty-appointed magistrates applied the laws, collected taxes, and assigned the work required for American Indian communities. It is little wonder that they often were highly criticized for bending the law and taking advantage of the native peoples under their control. Below them were many minor officials who made bureaucracy both a living and a way of life. To some extent, the clergy formed another branch of the state apparatus, although it had other functions and goals as well. Catholic religious orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits carried out the widespread conversion of the Indies, establishing churches in the towns and villages of sedentary Indians and setting up missions in frontier areas where nomadic peoples were forced to settle. Taking seriously the Pope's admonition to Christianize the peoples of the new lands as the primary justification for Spain's rule, some of the early missionaries became ardent defenders of Indian rights and even admirers of aspects of indigenous culture. For example, Franciscan priest Fray Bernardo de Sahagún, 1499 to 1590, became an expert in the Nahuatl language and composed a bilingual encyclopedia of Aztec culture, which was based on methods very similar to those by modern anthropologists. Other clerics wrote histories, grammars, and studies of native language and culture. Someone like Diego de Landa, Bishop of Yucatan, 1547, who admired much of the culture of the Maya, but who so detested their religion that he burned all their ancient books and tortured many Maya suspected of backsliding from Christianity. The recording and analysis of Native American cultures was designed primarily to provide tools for conversion. In the core areas of Peru and New Spain, the missionary church eventually was replaced by an institutional structure of parishes and bishoprics. Archbishops sat in the major capitals and complicated church hierarchy developed. Because the bishop crown nominated the holders of all such positions, the clergy, I've been saying clergy in past chapters, it's spelled C-L-E-R-G-Y. It's actually clergy, and I know that for a fact. But anyway, the clergy tended to be major supporters of state policy as well as primary influence on it. The Catholic Church profoundly influenced the culture and intellectual life of the colonies in many ways. The construction of churches, especially the great Baroque cathedrals of the capitals, simulated the work of architects and artists, usually reflecting European models, but sometimes taking up local themes and subjects. The printing press, introduced to America in the early 16th century, always published a high percentage of religious books as well as works of history, poetry, philosophy, law, and language. Much of intellectual life was organized around religion. Schools such as those of Mexico City and Lima, founded in the 1550s, were run by the clergy, and universities were created to provide training primarily in law and theology, the foundations of state and society. Eventually, more than 70 universities flourished in Spanish America. A stunning example of colonial intellectual life was the nun Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, 1651 to 1695, figure 19.7. Author, poet, musician, and perceptive commentator on her society. Sor Juana was welcome at the court of the viceroy in Mexico City, where her beauty and intelligence were celebrated. She eventually gave up secular concerns and her liberty at the urging of her superiors to concentrate on purely spiritual matters. To control the morality and orthodoxy of the population, the Tribunal of the Inquisition set up offices in the major capitals. Although American Indians usually were exempt from this jurisdiction, Jews, Protestants, and other religious dissenters were prosecuted and sometimes executed in an attempt to impose orthodoxy. Overall, church and state combined to create an ideological and political framework for the society of Spanish America. Brazil, the first plantation colony. The first official Portuguese landfall on the South American coast took place in 1500 when Pedro Alvarez Cabral, leader of an expedition to India, made a brief and perhaps accidental landfall on the tropical Brazilian shore. There was little at first to attract European interest except for the dyewood trees that grew in the forest, and thus the Portuguese crown paid little attention to Brazil for 30 years, preferring instead to grant licenses to merchants who agreed to exploit the dyewood. I've been saying drywood, it's dyewood. Pressure from French competitors finally moved the Portuguese crown to military action. The coast was cleared of rivals, and a new system of settlement was established in 1532. Minor Portuguese nobles were given strips of land along the coast to colonize and develop. The nobles who held the capitancies combined broad, seemingly feudal powers with a strong desire for commercial development. Most of them lacked the capital needed to carry out the colonization, and some had problems with the indigenous population. In a few places, towns were established, colonists were brought over, relations with the Native Americans were peaceful, and most importantly, sugar plantations were established using first Native American, then African slaves. In 1549, the Portuguese king sent a governor-general and other officials to create a royal capital at Salvador. The first Jesuit missionaries also arrived. By 1600, indigenous resistance had been broken in many places by military action, missionary activity, or epidemic disease. A string of settlements expanded along the coast, centered on port cities such as Salvador and Rio de Janeiro. These served roughly 150 sugar plantations, a number that doubled by 1630. The plantations were increasingly worked by African slaves. By 1600, the Brazilian colony had about 100,000 inhabitants, 30,000 emperors, 15,000 black slaves, and the rest Native Americans and people of mixed origin.